So this shot looks pretty bad, right? Well, I've intentionally set it up this way so that I can show you a set of super simple tips to go from this shot to this shot. Let's do this. So the very first step is getting our subject completely in focus. This step alone can make a big difference on how visually attractive your shot is. The best way to do this is to use manual focus on our camera, and then we can use the zoom tool on our DSLRs to get right into our subject, and this ensures that it is in focus. We're still a long way off from getting this image looking cinematic, but if you miss this step, the rest won't be nearly as effective. After that, we want to make sure we have the correct settings on our DSLRs. So the first two aspects we can change straight away is the shutter speed and the aperture. Both of these settings are different ways of controlling how much light hits the sensors of our DSLRs, and so in order to get the most out of a shot, generally we want to let as much light hit the sensor as possible, and I'll explain why in a bit. Right now I'm at a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, so we'll first bring that all the way down to 1/50th of a second, which is the industry standard for shooting film and video. So that's a good starting point. Now the next step is opening our aperture to allow even more light to hit the sensor. Right now I'm sitting on f8, but I'm going to raise that to f2.8, and as you can see our image is way too bright now, so the next step is bringing our ISO down. Now, if you're shooting on a lower to mid-range level Canon DSLR, then I generally recommend shooting at an ISO of no higher than 400. So currently we're at an ISO of 6400, which is massive, so let's drop that down to 200, and just like that, our image is already looking way better. So the ISO is like a last resort to getting more light into our images, and it adjusts how sensitive our cameras are to light, but the higher the number, the more digital noise will enter into our image, which isn't very cinematic at all. The final setting we need to adjust on our camera is the white balance. I can either navigate through the custom white balance settings on my Canon DSLR, or I can hold something white up in front of our subject and manually set that as the white balance. At the moment our image is really warm and orange, so I'm going to change the white balance to a daylight setting, and that will make our image look a bit better. So let's have a look at the before shot, and now after we adjusted our camera settings, and already we're making good progress. After that, the next step is framing and composition. The very first simple step to this is leveling our tripod. So far our shot has been on a bit of an angle, so leveling it will give us a more visually appealing image. Now the next easy way to get more cinematic footage is to separate the distance between the subject and the background. So in order to do this, I'm going to move my subject to a different table, and that means it will now be further away from the background. Next, I'm going to make sure my subject fits in the frame completely, and I can either center it or place it on either the left or right thirds by using the grid option on my DSLR. This gives our image a more visually pleasing composition. So here's before we leveled the camera, increased the distance and put some thought into the framing of our shot, and here's the after, and things are looking much better. Now, the reason we increase the distance between our subject and our background is so that we can make what's called the depth of field more shallow, which in other words is making the background more blurry. This is generally considered cinematic, and it's why people buy DSLRs over handycams or straight video cameras, because generally those sorts of cameras keep most of the frame in focus, whereas DSLRs allow for this high contrast, blurry background, sharp foreground imagery. Now, I said that I'd come back to aperture and talk again about the amount of light hitting the lens, and the reason is because the aperture is actually the key element in making our depth of field more shallow. So the really fast lenses like my Samyang 24mm f1.4, well, that f1.4 is the number that indicates how open we can have our aperture. And the more open our aperture is, the greater the difference will be between the background and the subject in terms of what's in focus. So let's take a quick look at this shot where we're shooting at an aperture wide open of f1.4 and an ISO of 100. Well, if we now close the aperture to an f-stop of 16, which in turn means we have to increase our ISO, not only do we get heaps of digital noise into our image, but notice how the background is now a lot less blurry. Well, that's the importance of our aperture. Okay, so with that out of the way, we now have a pretty decent shot when comparing it to the original. But I want to take this a stage further and talk about how we can really get this shot looking sexy and cinematic, and that is lighting. So in order to create a visual contrast between the foreground and the background, we want some sort of key lighting on our subject which is going to make it stand out or pop in the frame. Now, I've got this daylight bulb which pumps out a really decent output of light, in fact, too much light. So to help the situation out a bit, I simply grab some cheap baking paper from the kitchen and peg 2 strips over the light. This helps soften the light, which is much more cinematic than harsh lighting. Here's the harsh lighting, and now this is the softened lighting with the baking paper. Next is the part where you get to experiment a bit. I think it always adds a really nice visual touch, particularly with tech videos, to add some colour to the background of our shots. So I bought a super cheap LED strip from eBay. It was around 20 bucks, and that allows me to pump out a variety of colours in the background of my footage. As I also mentioned in my ultimate desk setup video, I have two Edison light bulbs which are a really warm orangey colour, and so those in combination with the LED strip look wicked in the background of my shots. And then because they're super blurry and out of focus, they look even better. Now after that we can do some slight colour correction, which basically involves increasing the contrast a bit and adding some sharpening, and there you have it. A pretty sweet cinematic shot, and it honestly only took a small amount of effort and creativity to achieve. Now the beauty about this is that everything we've just gone through is pretty much applicable to all DSLR cameras. I think too often people see some epic cinematic shots from their favourite filmmakers and they go out and splash all this money on a crazy camera and then get super bummed out when they start using it themselves and see that their footage looks nothing like they had imagined. As you saw here, only a small element was related to the camera, and the rest of it was all about framing, composition, lights, lenses, and more importantly, creativity. Now, a lot of you have been super generous in your comments on my videos over the past 6 months and are often surprised when I tell you I'm not using a crazy 4K camera, but in fact, I'm only using a sub $500 Canon T3i. I can tell you now for sure, the biggest jump in quality for my videos came from thinking about lights and being creative with my shots. Anyway, that is it for this video. I really hope this gives you some inspiration in making some sweet cinematic films, and if you do, tell me about them in the comments below. But my name's Sam, thanks heaps for watching, and I'll catch you guys later.